The panelists for tonight's discussion are Sarita Gupta, who is the director of the Future of Worker program at Ford Foundation. She leads the team that oversees Ford's efforts to actively shape a future of work that puts workers and their well-being at the center. And before that, she was the executive director of Jobs with Justice and the co-director of Caring Across Generations. Welcome, Sarita.
Thank you.
Next, we have Stephen Lerner, who's a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Commodification Initiative for Labor and Working Poor, where he leads work on the bargaining for the common good. He is the architect of the Justice for Janitors campaign and a union and community organizer. Welcome, Stephen. And last, we have Joseph A. McCartin, excuse me. It's a professor of history and executive director of the Comrades Initiative for the Labor and Working Poor of Georgetown University. He's written widely on the history of US workers and their movements, including in Dissent magazine. And his most recent book is Labor in America, A History, which is co-authored by Melvin Dubofsky. And I am your moderator. My name is Bianca Cunningham. I'm the director of the Democratic Socialists of America Fund. I'm also a staff organizer at an organization called Labor Notes and a co-founder of the Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America. And we're so happy to be with you tonight. So let's get started. I'm gonna say a little bit about how we're gonna run tonight's event. The first half, about 30 to 45 minutes, will be a discussion generated by questions I ask the panelists as a moderator. And then the last half, 30 minutes, the panelists will answer questions that you ask in the Q&A. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions as they come to you during the discussion. The chat box, on the other hand, is for making comments to each other and asking technical or logistical questions, but it will be closing soon so that we can focus on part one of the discussion. It will reopen for part two of the discussion, but we're asking that you you only use the Q&A box to answer questions. It will be open the whole time, and someone will be keeping track of the questions for part two. If you're on social media, you can also ask questions there. We have somebody that will be funneling those questions to me. All right. So we're gonna try to get us to as many questions as possible. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get started so we can get into it. And we're gonna ask that the panelists limit their answers to no more than 5 minutes so that we can have room for everyone's questions. So the first question is, could you each begin with your general thoughts about how the issues raised in your chapter in We Own the Future contribute to a democratic socialist vision of the topic, the future of workers? And I wanna start with Sarita. This one.
Great, thanks Bianca. It's great to be here with all of you. And I just wanna thank the Democratic Socialists of America Fund and Dissent magazine and the New Press for sponsoring this conversation tonight. And I'm so glad to be with Stephen and Joe. You know, we wrote this from this chapter really from the perspective of people coming out of the labor movement and involved in building a strong worker movement in this country. And we contributed to this book because we hold a vision for the future of workers, the labor movement, and the future of our democracy. And, you know, I think we outlined in the chapter some of our core beliefs that I do think really align with the democratic socialist vision. And just to share a few of those core beliefs, that, you know, we need a powerful workers movement is necessary for a real democracy. Nowhere in the world is there a democracy without a strong labor movement. And we know unions promote a higher level of economic equality and are a fundamental element of a free and democratic society. The second core belief that we outline is that we believe we need to achieve economic democracy, that the only way to rebuild and strengthen our democracy long-term is to prioritize full participation in the process of our economy, just as much as we might seek to empower the majority in the political process through voting. And that we really believe democracy must be practiced in all aspects of our society. Workers have to be valued and seen as real stakeholders in shaping our economic and political future. And we also must create other avenues for everyday people to understand and contemplate some of the large questions that are impacting them, their communities, and our society as a whole. And that fundamentally, those who are most impacted should be making decisions and shaping the decisions of our future. And that brings us to our next core belief, which is that we believe that the labor movement needs to reimagine and recreate itself to meet the many challenges that working people face today. We must be experienced as a movement that addresses the concerns of workers beyond wages and benefits. And I hope in the discussion we'll get to talk more about that. But really, as a movement, our ability to get beyond a focus on work sites, but instead to really embrace and see people, workers, as whole people, which must fundamentally shift our strategies and how we think about what collective bargaining could entail. And this inevitably changes the very nature of what a union contract covers, broadening what individuals can negotiate over and who they can negotiate with. And finally, our final core belief is that we have to center racial and gender equity as we forge our, the future, as we forge our pathway to our future. And this moment that we're in right now, which again, I hope as we get further into the discussion, as we see the uprisings around the movement for Black Lives inspired uprisings, that this is a moment that calls on the labor movement to really take stock of how we truly center racial and gender equity and really firmly stand up for systemic change in this moment. So I'll just close by saying, we think it's hard to think about democratic socialism without thinking about some of these core beliefs and issues that we've raised in the article, or in the chapter, I should say. And so ultimately, I think the question for all of us is, how do we build a movement that breathes life into all of what I just laid out? So let me stop there and let Joe and Stephen chime in here.
Joe.
Do you want to go ahead, Stephen, or?
Go ahead, Joe.
I'll just, I would just say, to add to what Sarita has laid out, that we started working on the idea for what became this chapter probably more than a year before we were actually invited even to contribute to the book. And we were disturbed by the way in which there was a lot of talk about the future of work, but a lot of that talk really didn't center workers. And so we were really happy to have a venue in this book to deeply dig into the way in which workers have to be centered as we think about the 21st century and our relationship to work. It's not a question of technology chiefly. It's not a question that robots will replace us so much as how we're organizing our relations of work in the years ahead. And so we focused in on that, and with the core beliefs that Sarita has pointed out, this is, we saw this centering of workers is very much in keeping and in spirit with what DSA is trying to do as well.
So I don't have a lot to add to that because they were brilliant, of course. But what I'd say is that I think key to what we wrote is that we're also calling, Sarita's a little more polite, she said the labor movement should reimagine itself, but we're also saying the labor movement as currently constructed is not up to the job that needs to be done to build the kind of movement we're doing. So that a core part of this was both to say, let's understand what's going on in the economy, let's make it clear that that inequality and the rights of workers and democracy are intertwined. And that seems to me to be a core idea behind democratic socialism, which is that those all have to happen. And then I think the thing we're going to come back to again and again, and you all can complain if we do it too much, is this idea that unions cannot limit themselves. I was brought up in the labor movement in the 1970s that what unions needed to think about was what happened between the four walls of the factory. That was our job. I was organizing apparel workers in the South. And everything else is a distraction. And what we're saying is something fundamentally different. That if the union is going to be a transformational vehicle, then it needs to look, as Sarita said, not just at the full lives of workers, but all the different ways that they can participate. And that seems to me to be something that sometimes on the left, people have this romantic vision of what unions were in the 30s and say, we just need to do that again. And part of what we were being very clear on is yes, we need to do some of that, but we also need to live in the moment we are and see the opportunities and change to make ourselves effective.
I hear all of that. Thank you. I'm just, as you were speaking, Stephen, I was just thinking about my experience working the Nissan campaign in Canton, Mississippi, and doing those house visits and hearing people talk about the vehicle that the company gave them and how it's the best job in town, and talking about, you know, and I was screaming inside saying, how could you not see that this is all connected? Like, your working conditions and the fact that this company can come in is directly affected to your ability to secure housing, to secure, you know, all of these things for your family. And so I wholeheartedly agree that we've got to make that connection and go outside the four walls of the factory. Thank you for that. So we'll start with you, Stephen, on this one. Your chapter points out that the problems workers face today is encapsulated in the fact that 8 men have as much wealth as half the world's population. We saw yesterday, Bezos made $13 billion. Just out of nowhere, right? It's like, oh, we made it overnight. So he's worth $228 billion, and that's so hard for me to even wrap my head around. And we're saying that, you know, these are not the effects of technology. It's not because of globalization. It's not because robots are going to replace us, to you all's point, but because of the specific policies of neoliberal globalization and financialization. So why is it important for socialists to understand the problem in that specific way?
Well, there's so many different levels it's important. So I'll do a few, and then hopefully Sarita and Joe will build on it. It's first, if we don't understand how the economy is working, then how can we offer solutions? And, you know, a lot of the way people think is still governed by the idea that you get a paycheck from that employer and then you fight that employer. But the way the economy has been reorganized is the entities that have power, especially under financialization, are increasingly Wall Street and hedge funds and private equity, and they may not be our direct employer. So if we're going to fight with who has power for change, then we have to understand who has that power. When the Chicago teachers recently went on strike, the bond rating agencies, which decide how much interest a city pays when they get a loan, said if they paid too much money, they were going to change, if they get too big a raise, they were going to change the bond rating for the city, which would then make it harder for them to borrow money. That we need to understand, one, for ourselves, what's going on. Then second, we have to make it understandable for workers, because otherwise what happens is people feel hopeless. They say a bunch of folks are rich, we're poor, it's my fault, we internalize it. So when we can talk about what's really going on in the world, that a handful of the super rich are rigging the system at every level to enrich themselves at our cost, at our expense, that starts to focus us a little bit. And then it leads us to start developing the kind of strategies that we need. I have a shirt on, you may not be able to see it. It says hedge funds equal inequality. Understanding that hedge funds pay less, that the hedge fund managers together make the top 12 or something, make more money than all the kindergarten teachers in America is important. It's important because we should be morally outraged. It should be important because it shows how the system works. But as importantly, it lets us start aiming our firepower and our energy at who the real bad guys are. And I'll just give one very concrete example. We've just launched a campaign in Connecticut, a Bargaining for Common Good campaign. And I'll just throw out some numbers that sort of explain neoliberalism to me. The state budget is $19 billion. There's a deficit as a result of COVID of $4 billion. The 17 richest people in Connecticut are worth $70 billion. Their wealth has gone up $4 billion since the pandemic. So when we are organizing people against austerity, when we're organizing people to fight for more, when we're organizing people to say that there's a lot of money, being able to say, here's a guy who pays less tax than you, whose wealth has gone up as much as the entire state budget, that starts to crystallize for people what's wrong. And then it lets us know who we have to fight. And that's what I want to really sharpen, which is if you work for most companies in this country, who signs your paycheck is not who has power. So we have to figure out who has power. When, one more example, when GM shut down the Lordstown plant, they shut down that plant and the amount they saved was the same amount of money that they spent on stock buybacks, meaning the company bought its own stock so they could boost their own salaries. And then they said, oh, we don't have enough capital, we have to shut the plant. Workers understanding that that had nothing to do with how the quality of their work, the quality of the car, the need for the car. It was a financial arrangement that made the company richer at their expense, but did not create greater wealth. So I think understanding neoliberalism and financialization is central. And then it also takes us to something we should get into later, that all of this has to be global, because capital is global and it moves all over.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Just to build on what Stephen just said, I think there's a few other points I would make. I mean, I think it's not enough for us to say that it's important to be against neoliberalism. It just does not work with most people. We have to create the entry points in the way that Stephen's talking about for people to truly understand the architecture of our economy, how much it has shifted, and really understand who is making decisions. I mean, the work that we've all been trying to do is build labor and community formations to really tackle these challenges. And for labor and community groups together to deeply understand who really is making the decisions is really critical, not only for labor fights, but broader community fights that we know are also fights of the working class. I also just want to lift up that often, sorry, I have a dog barking in the back. Unfortunately, there must be a UPS truck coming by because that's the only time she seems to bark. Sorry for any UPS drivers. But, you know, I think often, Stephen really a few years ago when we were working on some campaigns together, we really recognized that often we're like fighting the good fight. Like I'm a soccer player, we're on the field, we're figuring out our strategy, and we realize we're actually on the wrong field. Like we're actually believe we're fighting the right employer or the right boss, and the reality is we're not. And so we have to get on the right field and really play the game smart. And part of that is helping people understand who is the 1%, who is the 1/10 of the 1%. Like it's, again, not enough to be like the 1% and the 99%. Those are all important frames, but now we have to take it one step further to help define who those individuals are. And then really adapt, evolve, and strengthen our strategies. We leave a lot of power on the table when we don't fundamentally understand how and where we can intervene with worker power. You know, I always sit with like capital strategies are really important. And as worker organizations, we actually have to understand when and how to deploy a set of strategies that are about challenging the financialization of our economy and holding those in the 1/10 of the 1% accountable to the decisions that they're making.
I would just underline two words from what Sarita was just saying, and one is accountability and the other is power. And I think when you name names and you focus on, you know, real people, real financial actors, real hedge funds like the kind that Stephen's referring to, that's necessary to be able to hold those people and entities accountable. It's also necessary to be able to identify how power works. When we think about the broad neoliberal system, it just becomes a little diffuse. But power is at the center of sustaining it. And what we need to do is surface that and attack it.
That sounds great. And I also want to shout out Communication Workers of America for seeing this problem 5-6 years ago and developing a really amazing training for their members on reversing runaway inequality that really highlights the problem of financialization and breaks it down in an accessible way. And I feel like they've really been leading the way in the labor movement and taking on those conversations. Sometimes I spy on capitalists, and yesterday I spied on a panel, and their neoliberal answer to this is that we should just invest pension funds to minority-owned businesses. Like the problem is that the pension funds that are invested only go to the white folks, the white big banks, and they don't go to like small minority-owned business. So if we did that, then that would reverse all the inequality. And I was like, "Ooh." So I appreciate you all answering that question. And I also oftentimes see my own coworkers and people thinking that the answer is to invest then in the stock market, right? It's to play the game. And so I guess this leads us into our next question, which is how can socialists respond to the problem of such stark economic and political inequality? Your chapter chapter focuses on rebuilding the labor movement through remaking collective bargaining and organizing campaigns. And you point to several examples of such campaigns: Fight for a Fair Economy, Caring Across Generations, In It Together, which share the strategy of bargaining for the common good that we've seen come up so often, mostly in teacher strikes in the last couple of years. Is this sufficient, or does it need to be part of a larger socialist movement? And I'll give this to you, Joe.
Well, I think we do see it as part of a larger movement. What I would say is, Bianca, referring to your question and what you said just before that about CWA, different parts of the movement have been surfacing the central ideas that we are working with in our chapter and what we're trying to organize around. Unions like CWA have been pioneering. Stephen and his work with Justice for Janitors 20 and 30 years ago was really laying the groundwork intellectually, I think, and in organizing terms for how we're thinking about this problem now. And Sarita, both with her time at Jobs with Justice and the Community Labor Coalition she worked to build there, but also in the pioneering campaign of Caring Across Generations. You know, all of these things have helped to kind of create the experiential and ideas that we are focusing on as we think about what that response should be. And to refer back to the earlier thread of the conversation, our central idea is that the 21st century economy has been thoroughly reorganized in a way in which we're continuing to fight on the wrong field, as Sarita aptly put it there. I mean, we're not waging the right fight often with the right people in the right place at the right level, to turn to Stephen's idea. The economy's been reorganized both from below and above. From below, you know, what's happened is the fissuring of the workplace, right? The breakdown of the relationship between employer and employee that used to be fairly stable. And collective bargaining emerged in a period of time when the level of subcontracting and fissuring and things like that that now characterize the economy wasn't really there. We had a pretty integrated mass production economy in which collective bargaining really grew. We've seen that breakdown. And then from above, we've seen financialization reorganize the economy from above and to lead to new entities like hedge funds. There were no hedge funds when the CIO formed in the 1930s, right? When the Wagner Act was passed. But now we're confronting an economy in which entities like that have great power. And so our view is that what we need to do is have a strategy that accounts for both the disorganization that's occurred from below and the concentration of power from above. And to begin to adapt the tool of collective bargaining to the way that the economy actually functions in the 21st century. And that means we can't approach bargaining the way we did in the mid to late 20th century, in which we're focused primarily on wages, hours, and working conditions. And we need to be able to get to the bargaining table those who have the real power. And often it's not the people who are giving you your paycheck, it's the people that they have telling them what to do. We need to be able to raise at the bargaining table questions that are dominant in workers' lives today. Housing, for example. Every time we fight and win something at the bargaining table that raises wages, workers are seeing that taken away and a skyrocketing cost of housing in the country, and with gentrification and things like that. So our approach is about reorganizing bargaining, and both Stephen and Sarita are pioneers in this, and they can probably extrapolate on what I'm saying by referring to the, you know, to the direct work they've done with things like Justice for Janitors and Caring Across Generations. So I'll turn it to them.
Stephen, go ahead.
It's interesting because maybe touching on Justice for Janitors for a second gives us all an air of reality, which is what most people thought about was, oh, janitors work for a cleaning contractor and the cleaning contractor pays minimum wage and they're a terrible person, so we should go war on them. And what we realized is a cleaning contractor and how the economy is restructured is just a payroll agency. It's really about the building owner who has all the money. And the building owner hides behind the cleaning contractor to say, well, it's not my fault. So in Justice for Janitors, what was fascinating in our first campaign in Denver, Colorado, I remember we're marching on the boss with a bunch of workers. And the workers said, all of a sudden turned against the union. And they said, well, if I get a union in my building, all that will happen is they'll fire the one union contractor and bring in a non-union contractor. And then a bunch of people in the union said, oh, these workers don't understand the union, except they were much smarter than we were. They understood completely that we had a flawed strategy, which was to get one building union in a competitive marketplace where the result would be is they'd get rid of the union contractor and get a non-union one. So we literally went back to the exact same group of workers with the new strategy and said, we're going to organize all the buildings at once. We're going to raise wages for everybody in the city, and we're going to take on the building owners who have the power. And that same group of workers, all of a sudden, were pro-union. The point being that if we don't have a strategy that makes sense, one, workers shouldn't be part of, are smart, and we'll say that's a stupid strategy. But second, if we want to inspire people to take the risk of fighting the boss and trying to make things better, then we have to understand what's going on. And so in bargaining for common good and all these campaigns, we're trying to do multiple things at once, which is one, understand who really has power, as we're saying, how we take them on, and then how workers in a deep way can be involved in changing all aspects of their lives. And I think, you know, again, the Chicago teacher strike, one of their demands was around housing, because how do students learn when 20,000 Chicago students are homeless? And then, you know, the big hedge funds and all say, well, if the teachers just tried harder. So I guess what I'd say on the very specific question, I think it's a precondition and necessary if we're going to fight for democratic socialism to have a powerful labor movement. That's where Sarita started. But obviously it's insufficient in and of itself, because we need to be part of a broader movement that's about transformational change. And one part of that is our engagement at work. I'll just give one more example. You know, I feel like Sarita did her metaphor, we're on the wrong field. I think also what we do is we have both our hands tied behind our back, and then we try to headbutt our way into success here. Is that if you take a company like Blackstone, they simultaneously employ, you know, as a direct employer, I think 50 or 100,000 people. They also are one of the biggest landlords in the country. They are also one of the biggest lenders. The way financialization is reorganized is that these companies are an all part of our lives. And if our approach is just to go after them in one way, we're only fighting with one hand behind our back. So I think if we're gonna, the final thing I'd say is, I think workers learn through struggle. People learn because they're in a fight with the boss. When I worked for the farm workers years ago, Cesar Chavez said, the best way to learn about police brutality is on the end of a billy club. It's not an intellectual exercise. And so all the campaigns that are mentioned here are where workers are directly confronting people and engaging in challenging their power. So I just got to note that I should be succinct and be quiet. So I won't go farther except to say that, yes, it needs to be part of a bigger movement, but if we don't do this first, I don't know how that movement has the power to make the change we need.
Thank you for that. So I'll just get into our next question in the interest of time. People often assume that labor struggles are limited to bread and butter issues such as wages and benefits, and don't necessarily centralize fights against issues like racism. In your chapter, you're asking people to reimagine how the labor movement can address issues of democracy and inequality. My experience is that talking to unions about it's always an afterthought, and they're always so worried that it's going to be divisive. What about our racist members in this part? And so the conversation gets kicked down the road until, you know, the next thing happens. And so how do you see the fights around issues like racism, sexism, immigration status being taken up by the labor movement? And we'll start with you here, Sarita.
Sure. I can totally appreciate everything you just said, Bianca. And I guess what I would say is the labor movement, look, the labor movement has a long history of standing in solidarity on these issues. But what we need now is to build upon that type of solidarity and evolve it to a relationship that is rooted in a deep appreciation of structural racism and structural sexism. Unions need a really different approach on the questions of race, gender, and immigration. these are not issues. These are not, you know, not to be disrespectful, but like, these are not caucuses. These are not sidebar things. They are actually the lived experiences of the majority of working people and members of the labor movement. And so what is needed is actual conversations about the role of power and capital and how they together preserve a social hierarchy that promotes white supremacy that many in the labor movement have benefited from. And the forces that are attacking unions have been relentless. So I want to be clear about that. And there are some unions right now who are sort of saying we're hunkering down and we're just sort of staying focused on our bread and butter issues, while there are others who realize they really need to look up and connect with other movements. Solidarity has to go across all of these divides and, like I said, evolve, because members fundamentally live at these intersections. We fight, like labor will fight for contracts to increase wages and benefits, yet when members go home, they're dealing with police violence, they're dealing with ICE raids, they're dealing with food deserts, they're dealing with unaffordable housing and transportation, and the list goes on. So we have to, as a labor movement, acknowledge the existence of an underclass, like literally. And I think the current uprisings in the streets in response to the murder of George Floyd and the state-sanctioned police violence on Black bodies are composed of the very people who are standing up for our democracy and values. These uprisings are not only about police violence, but they are also fundamentally about the economic and political disenfranchisement of communities. We are physically seeing the manifestation of what I think is needed and we need to be embracing more of, and that white people in motion with Black, Indigenous people of color. We're sort of so, like, long gone are the days of siloing the labor movement from the other parts of the social movements in the US and I would argue around the world. We're beyond tactical ideas here. We have to be about the real structural change. And I just think we are going to see a continuation of movement moments, whether it's the families and kids being locked up in immigration detention centers, or the repression tactics that we're seeing by this administration right now in places like Portland and Kansas City. Like, these are attacks on our democracy, and they're attacks on the uprising of Black and brown people. And so how the labor movement responds in this moment is critical. And I'll just close by saying, you know, I think I want to go back to the points that Joe and Stephen made in the earlier question. Fundamentally, campaigns and organizing are transformative experiences. And that if we really understand that that is actually how we will get to build the kind of mass movements that we need in this country. Like, carrying across generations could easily have just been a campaign about rights for domestic workers who've been excluded from labor rights. But we understood that we needed to actually center the experiences of domestic workers and understand all the forces at play and really build a broader mass movement that's going to demand a whole new transformation of our care sector and an actual valuing of our care economy. That is the leap that I think we need to make now. And we're just in a moment of great leaps. And I think the labor movement really has to, in the recreation and reimagining of itself, needs to be bold enough to make those leaps right now, especially on these issues of race, gender, and immigration.
So in the chat box, it was posted what the booklet on, the link to the Bargaining for Common Good demands. And when you read them, which I hope everybody will and internalize them, is the demands are very concrete. There are demands, for example, about police out of schools in LA that the union fought for. But what the union talks about is they went through a 1.5-year struggle with their own members to get the members to understand why, even if they somehow felt safer with police in the school, why that actually was the opposite. We have demands, very concrete demands about sanctuary schools and sanctuary universities. So without going through the list, what I love about Bargaining for Common Good is we're taking, I think Sarita's point is it's almost like these are things that we do because we're good people on the side. But when you center it in the work, when you struggle with members about a bargaining demand about the school to prison pipeline, then what that means is they're internalizing it's deep, and then the fight makes it real versus it just being like a resolution at the convention every 4 years. And I think that's the key thing about bargaining for common good, is when you look at the kind of demands people are creating, it means that we're bringing to life in the moment we're battling the boss, the things that affect all of our lives. So I think it's got to be central to what we do, and that's what we're trying to do. And we're not doing it because we're nice people. We're doing it because we won't win if we don't figure out how to tackle these issues. So Joe's a nice person.
I was going to say, you're a nice person, Stephen. So I would just add just really quickly, and what Sarita and Stephen had said is just spot on. The idea that we have an economy that's also a caste system. You know, I think that Isabel Wilkerson's essay on that recently, I think was very powerful and persuasive. We have a caste system in effect, and we cannot empower workers without also attacking that racially based caste system in which people of color, you know, disproportionately suffer. And that's just something that, as Stephen said, we have to do if we want to be successful.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful comments. We are going to move on to the second portion of this program. So we'll ask that we're going to turn to the chat box in case you have any technical or logistical questions. We'll turn it back on briefly, just in case. So now we're going to do the questions of friends and comrades. So those of you who put stuff in the Q&A, or if you're asking questions online, it's not too late to add more questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or on whichever social media you're using. Let us know. We're interested to hear from you all. And while we're waiting on you all to put questions, I just want to plug again the book. I have to look for it. We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism American Style. For those of you who are attending this panel tonight, you can receive 25% off by following the link in the chat box. And so it's a great read. There's a lot of great stuff in there. So many talented authors. And so we do suggest that you check it out. So let's get to the first question from the audience. And the first question is, given how determined to eliminate unions the usual suspects are, the pandemic has given them another opening crash course, the teacher and healthcare unions with new innovation. Andrew Cuomo is partnering with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop a smarter education system, and the tech giants are focusing on touch-free medical attention. What is our strategy to put the brakes on this, given all the money and influence these people have? And that question can go to anyone.
Well, that's a good question. I guess in a way, I think we've started to answer it in our presentation, which is if you look at it narrowly, how do we stop Cuomo and the Gateses from claiming that, you know, nobody needs schools anymore because we could do it all on the computer? If you look at it narrowly, we'll lose. If you look at it from where we started, which is how is the economy constructed and who has power and what do they care about, then you can start to develop multiple strategies. One, for example, is that, you know, Sarita mentioned capital stewardship before. The capital that funds many of these companies that are doing this is public employee pension funds. I call it assisted suicide. There's a couple $1 trillion of money that's set aside to pay pensions. It's workers' deferred capital. And then that literally is invested in companies whose mission is to destroy public schools and public universities. So I think some of this goes back to where we started, which is understanding who has power, how they have power, and how we impact that power. And I actually want to be more optimistic than the question, which is yes, there, you know, we all know about the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism, but I see the other side of it, that what the multiple pandemics of COVID, of white supremacy, and now mass unemployment and austerity have done is expose the incredible failures of the system. And this is the greatest opportunity I've seen in my lifetime to think about how we fight for fundamental change. If the stock market can go up when 25 million or 40 million people are out of work, that shows the system's broken. So I think we have to both show the system's broken, show who broke it, and then going back to what Sarita said at the very beginning, then present our vision of what it should be, not just to critique it.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I would just add to what Stephen has said, that we need collective action. That without collective action, we can't bring about the kind of change we need. We can't do it, politically or electorally, although that's important. We have to elect the right people. But absent the sort of revival of collective action, we're not going to get the change we need. And what is really, I think, exciting about the recent years, and I share Stephen's optimism on this, is that we are seeing literally workers resurrecting collective action in all kinds of creative ways. Certainly we saw that a couple of years ago with the teacher strikes in places like West Virginia and Arizona. But that's not the only instance in recent times where we've seen workers recovering the will to act collectively. There have been a lot of spontaneous actions workers have taken in response to COVID, for example, nurses and others of walking outside and staging silent demonstrations over their lack of PPE, for example. And then, we've seen a massive collective action in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And that, I think, just as, both Stephen and Sarita have observed that, campaigns are learning vehicles for people. All of these things, I think, have also been opportunities for learning and teaching. And, I think one of the problems that labor faced at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of this century was the virtual disappearance of the experience of being on strike and going on offense with a strike, as say the Chicago teachers did in 2012. But now we're starting to see workers get that experience, and we're starting to see generally people get the experience of acting collectively. And I do believe that that's a transformative kind of experience.
Can I just add to that? I think in addition to the collective action, it's really important to keep in mind, like, we are in a global pandemic. The US is doing the worst. People are freaking dying in their workplaces right now. They are dying. And we're like, we can't normalize that. Like, it's not okay, the sheer number of people who are getting infected and dying, and the disproportionate number of those people being Black and brown workers. It's unacceptable. And frankly, and immigrant workers, I should say, given meatpacking and all. But so there's that crisis. There's the crisis of the economy and the questions of job security and access to unemployment insurance. And it shows how absolutely broken our system is, how fragile our system is for the vast majority of people. And then you have the crisis of both police violence and repression that we're seeing right now. And I think in all of that, what gives me hope in the midst of all of the doom and gloom of the crises is actually that people are standing up and demanding that they want to have a say in shaping the decisions that are being made about all aspects of their lives. Should schools reopen or shouldn't they? Should they be able to have health and safety in their workplaces? It's actually opening up a whole new conversation about agency and the ability to govern over decisions that I think is an enormous opening for the labor movement right now, for all of us who care about democracy and the values that we've been talking about.
Thank you for that. And I think that something that's coming to mind for me is that workers often say, well, we don't have the right to strike. Well, now is the time to get out regardless. West Virginia, that's all I'll say. We gotta do that. So thank you for that, the remarks on collective action and really expanding the conversation. So I want to pivot to our next question. It's really interesting. Somebody asked, how do we work to make trans people included and respected in the labor movement?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm happy to kick this off. I mean, I think there is so much work to be done. And frankly, not just in the labor movement, but across social movements in general on this question. Because I think that there is such an evolution of how we think about gender and gender identity and the ability for us to embrace that gender fluidity, if you will, and all that's associated with that, norms, identities, issues, like the whole bit. And so I think in the labor movement, there has to be a very deep conversation, much like we've talked about around race and gender and immigration. But I think the issue that trans people experience in particular needs to be lifted up in pretty profound ways. And I'm really hopeful about some of the work that I see happening among trans workers. There's great worker centers that are beginning to come together that are focused on LGBTQ communities and workers and really figuring out how to lift up these issues. The question for the labor movement will be, are you going to use the usual script of like, it's a side issue, it's a group over here dealing with this, or are we going to embrace this as part of an ongoing norm? I mean, the other thing I'll just say is, I'm a mother of a 10-year-old daughter. And let me tell you, when we talk about gender identity and we talk about trans people, my daughter looks at me like I have 20 heads. She's like, why is this, like, why do you, people of your generation and older not get this? I don't understand. And there's just such a clarity amongst young people in our world, like in our lives, that I think we have a lot to learn from them about how we truly embrace and understand the issues around gender fluidity and how that manifests in the labor movement broadly.
Anybody else want to add?
I would just echo what Sarita says about younger people and how they're going to help make this change happen. I have two daughters, a bit older than Sarita's, and it's the same. I mean, I think young people, and part of the problem with the labor movement, I think, is that it aged over time. And it didn't grow among the youngest people. No offense to you, Stephen. But no, I think that, younger people as they come in, I think will help to make some of this important change happen. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to make, like, Sarita was so eloquent, I just want to make a very practical suggestion. One of the things that we're doing in Bargaining for Common Good is developing bargaining demands. And so we've developed bargaining demands around racial justice, around immigration. We should start developing demands. And what I want to stress, because I think this is really important, when we develop creative and new demands, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to win them with the employer, but it gives us a way to go deep with members. So in the same ways that the LA teachers had a 1.5 year discussion with their members about why police out of schools was good for teachers, good for students, and good for education, if people start to write demands and then we go to the bargaining committees and we say, we want this to be part, and then we educate members about it, then it takes it deep. And I'll just use this as a chance to say that I think we put up in the chat box earlier that we've created a map in Bargaining for Common Good that is an interactive map that has contract expirations over the next 1.5 years for 5 million workers coming up. And I really urge people to go on that map and then get the secret password so you can go deep, because you can then sort by industry, by sector, by geography. We have 5 million workers are going to be in bargaining one way or the other over the next 1.5 years. And I think we have this incredible opportunity to synchronize bargaining, coming up with common demands. And the way I try to think about it is, for those who follow the Chicago teacher strike, imagine that by 10 or 50 or 100. If 1 year from now, though, we had these kinds of mass strikes that were based on these kinds of demands. And so I think a simple part is, once you throw away the idea that all we can bargain around is wages and benefits, then it opens up the world to what the mission of the union is. And then it lets us embrace and involve all sorts of people who normally feel like totally alienated. This has got nothing to do with me. And my primary issue in life is not whether I get one more holiday 4 years down the road. We want to talk about having control over our lives. And we have control over our lives because we take on the most powerful people and have a plan to beat them.
Yes, and I would also just add, let's be more inclusive in our language. When we open up a meeting and say brothers and sisters, feel free to add friends and siblings and comrades and whatever else is, includes everybody in the room and not make assumptions. So yes, thank you for all of that. I felt that. Okay, so the next question is, how does mass unemployment affect how we think about these strategies? How should the labor movement think about its relationship to unemployed people?
Sarita, Joe, can I go first, or one of you want to jump in?
You've thought a lot about this. You should do this.
So I think the big mistake we would make is to sort of, going back to where Sarita started, is saying mass unemployment and unemployed councils are over here, and then our regular union work is here. I see three interrelated things. One is we're facing mass evictions. 28 million people could be evicted from their apartments and homes. What do those people have in common? They're unemployed. We've already built a list of 700,000 people who are defining themselves as rent strikers. So I think the first thing is we have to do the nitty-gritty work of figuring out who actually is out of work and who's ready to fight. Then second, we actually shouldn't think about it as unemployed. We should think about it as unemployed and marginally employed, because lots of people are working 1 and 2 hours a day. But I think we can go from eviction defense and rent strike, that then creates the army of people who are learning how to fight. Then the fight becomes unemployed councils. And then I think we can connect the unemployed councils with the austerity the public sector is about to do, because there'll be mass layoffs in the public sector. So our sort of theme is this is all interconnected. The fight about rent, the fight about unemployment, and the fight about austerity are really all the same fight. I think it might have something to do with capitalism. That might be in a book. And so then I think if we think about that as one campaign, then over the next couple months, we can link them together and then have the kind of fight that we need to have, because there's no solution to unemployment if we don't deal with taxes, if we don't deal with power, et cetera. So it has to be one fight. And I think the public sector unions who are going to bear the brunt of some of this can play a key role, because they can link the fights about austerity and then their own members losing their job as part of a bigger fight.
I think you said that beautifully, Stephen. I don't know that I have more to add to that.
Joe, you have anything?
No, I think, housing might be the linchpin right now for how to connect all of these things, because it's the immediate crisis, as Stephen said, we're about to face a wave of mass evictions. And because of what's happened to housing over the past couple of decades and the way financialization has invaded the housing front, and it's such a concentration of financial power that being able to make the connections that Stephen talks about here, I think is going to be really, really crucial. Yeah.
There's just one thing to say. The same people that are going to evict us are the same people that have $1 trillion in what they call dry powder of capital, that are going to buy up every company that's in bankruptcy and then want to cut wages. That's going back to your first question. You have to understand the economy, who's there, and it's really a handful of people in a lot of cities. And I think how we do eviction defense, we actually don't want to call it eviction defense. We want to call it eviction blockades. And who does the eviction? Marshals and sheriffs. So you'll hear it here first. We're building to start leading the demand and start the protest to demand that marshals and sheriffs not be used for eviction. Talk about abuse of police power. Armed people coming into people's apartments to move their furniture out. This is going to be a point of struggle that's critical for all of us to be in. And it leads directly to unemployed councils, because I can't pay my rent because I don't have a fucking job. And it's not right, you're going to kick me out of my apartment, and it's not right, you're getting richer while I'm losing everything I have.
And for those who know a bit about history, in the 1930s, before there was a CIO, there were unemployed councils. And the experience of workers coming together to defend each other from eviction laid the groundwork in cities like Detroit and Chicago for what became the industrial union movement shortly thereafter.
Thank God.
So I'm going to try to fit in. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was saying
one more question, but go ahead.
No. I was just saying thank God for Joe, and the historian amongst the three of us is always very helpful. Anyway, go ahead, Bianca.
Amazing. Let's get one more question in. So it's a two-part one, so we'll try to get it in. Fewer than 8% of the private sector American labor movement are unionized. Why has the American labor movement lost the debate with 92% who declined to join unions? And also there are obstacles to expanding the us first demands, the broader bargaining for the common good aims. As a labor leader, I run against both all the time. Any ideas on how to confront these two realities?
I'm happy to start. I'll start with the unions have lost the debate with the vast majority of the public. And I mean, some of that, let's be real, is about a very well-financed anti-union sort of industry that exists, and that we should acknowledge it and know has been very sophisticated in putting out very clear anti-union messages that have now been so deeply seated in our culture. So that's one. But there is actually responsibility that the labor movement itself needs to take for why we are where we are in terms of losing the debate. When the union movement made the decision, when the labor movement has made the decision to only represent the interests of their members and not actually represent the interests of a much broader working class, that is like the fundamental cause for why we have lost the debate. And people's belief in unions being vehicles that can be truly transformative vehicles for change in the way that we're talking about. When the labor movement continues practices and norms that suggest that anyone who is not a white man in traditional labor jobs or union jobs are sort of the other, and we keep othering people, we continue to lose the debate. When we don't take a moment to say, it's not enough to say we stand with the movement for Black lives, but that we are in fact part of the movement for Black lives, because so many of our members are part of, let alone people who should be our members. Like when the labor movement can see that all those people who are protesting are part of our movement, that is when we will shift our ability to reach the broad masses of people. But these are really some of the most fundamental reasons we aren't, as a labor movement, speaking to people in a way that actually inspires them to believe that we are the vehicle by which we're going to win real social and structural change. And that's fundamentally a problem. We've become so internal in our communications and so okay with just being seen as the vehicles to raise wages and provide benefits that we've totally lost sight of the social movement aspects. We need a new social contract today. And I think the vast majority of people don't believe it's the labor movement who's going to make that happen. And that's a really big problem. So until we start learning to talk about these issues in the way that Joe and Stephen and I have been talking about, and really begin to develop the campaigns in an intersectional approach in the way that we're talking about, we're going to continue to lose the debate.
Joe?
Over to either of you.
Yeah, I think that's really, that says so much. I would just add very briefly that despite all, all of the anti-union animus that fills our culture, when you ask most workers, would you like to be in a union? Most still say they would. And despite the weakness of unions now, and despite, in some sense, the lack of real transformative vision, if we can adopt the kind of outlook that Sarita has laid out, I think, there's a real chance to build and to grow this movement. And especially in this moment. I mean, we've entered a historical moment that I think is really rare and unique, where so much is in flux right now. And a real crisis. We often use the word crisis, but nothing like what we currently faced has been faced in any of our lifetimes. And certainly not, I think, in this country since the depths of the Great Depression. And I think in a moment like this, things break open. It's a hinge in time. And it, I think, requires vision and action to take advantage of it.
And then I'd add, I remember my first house visit in Boone, North Carolina. And I knock on somebody's door and we're talking and I say, well, if you're in the union, you make more money, your life's better and all that. And she says, I know that's all true, except the problem is if you try to join the union, you get fired, you get blacklisted, you never work again. But outside of that, the union's really great. And I think workers know through experience that we do not have a strategy or plan or the power to beat employers. So when somebody tries to organize a union, they're risking everything. And workers are willing to do that. when there's a strategy, a plan, when they're involved, when we understand what's going on. And the story I always like to tell about this, and it's actually true versus some stories I might tell, is when we started the Justice for Janitors campaign, all these folks said, you'll never succeed. Janitors are undocumented. They're part-timers. They're contracted out. They don't have benefits. They only work 4 hours a night. You'll never organize janitors. So then we developed a strategy to organize janitors. And then when we started winning and organized 200,000 workers that were unorganizable, supposedly, everybody would say, well, anybody can organize janitors. They're immigrants, and you know how radical they are, or they only work 4 hours a night, so of course they're willing to go on strike. Workers don't, I actually don't think we've lost the debate. 92% of workers did not choose not to be in the union. 92% of people have been bludgeoned for trying to join. And then we have to be really self-critical. The labor movement spends less money in organizing now than it has in years. People have been afraid to use their collective bargaining power with partially unionized employer to unionize. And I think the key thing that Joe's getting to is union growth comes in spurts. It doesn't come incrementally. And when you look at history, there's times where there's massive growth. And we have that potential now. And I guess what I really want to stress here is I wrote a piece in the American Prospect recently called What Is Not to Be Done. It's a little humor in there for those who know the humor. And the point being is that if our key goal is to try to recreate the labor movement of the past, we should give up and just say, let's go to the beach or something. We have to build a movement that does everything Joe and Sarita talked about, that is taking on who really has power. And the final thing I'd say, it's really interesting. I've done a fair amount of construction organizing. And if you go to a non-union construction worker and say, do you want to join the union? They say you're crazy. If you say to a non-union construction worker, do you want to go work in a union job and make twice what you're making now and be in the apprenticeship program? They say, of course. The issue isn't that they're anti-union. The issue is they don't think they can beat non-union employers. If you go to most non-union workers and say you could be a union telephone worker or a union public sector worker, they say hallelujah. If you say, do you want to enter a process where you're going to get fired, blacklisted, never have a job again, and have your life destroyed, they say, well, maybe that's not a good idea. And it's a good idea if it's part of a mass movement that's challenging capital. And that's what I really just want to hit at the end, because we haven't said that, is the American labor movement, unlike the labor movements in most countries, gave up or actually opposed trying to influence and have control over how capital is used and invested. And that has to be a key piece when we talk about capital stewardship. If the employers and the ruling class have control of all the money, we won't win. So we have to figure out, it goes back to your first question, how financialized capitalism works and how we can seize the moment to leverage it to our extent. Because the key thing here is, just as we're in crisis, they're in crisis. They are terrified. They know how fragile things is. And what I'd end this little thing with, we started a campaign where we're going to the homes of the rich and powerful. We went to Greenwich, Connecticut, and we dropped body bags in front of the richest people. We're going back out to the Hamptons. Anybody wants to go? July 30th, I think. We're taking a crew out to the Hamptons to go visit all the billionaires in the Hamptons and say, you're going to take our homes? We're going to go move in with you at your resorts out here. That we have to directly get in the face and challenge the super rich. And I really just think this is key, because it's where Sarita, and we have to name the names, show how they're evil, and then we have to directly confront them. Because until they are terrified that their place in society is going to be lost, then they are not going to, that they're going to engage in capital strikes and avoid any kind of change. So anyway, now I'm rambling, but I'm kind of fired up and angry.
I hear you with the fired up and angry. You kind of just summed my life up in the last 5 years as a worker who was fired for organizing, trying to organize a union or successfully doing so, and seeing my coworkers' jobs be systematic. They've been laid off systematically ever since then with no recourse. Yes, we want a union. Yes, we have grievance and arbitration. Woohoo, we have a retail union. But it doesn't matter if the employer still has all the power to close stores and get rid of people. And I think that that's been my experience and our experience. And so I really appreciate you highlighting that in your remarks, Stephen. I'm told that we have one more time for one more question, I guess, maybe two. So somebody asked, what are some effective and plausible to win policy levers that can increase worker power?
Sarita, you're sort of working on this.
So effective and plausible to win levers. I mean, I think there's, on the policy front, there's actually a lot that's on the table right now, given actually the crises that we've been talking about. So one is, I think there's a huge opportunity to actually fundamentally win paid leave policies that would help millions and millions of workers, and not have it just be like, we should not accept that it's just a temporary thing, but that we really need a federal, like a national paid leave policy in this country, like every other freaking industrialized country in the world has. So that's one sort of policy lever. And how that relates to worker power is, it's really fundamentally, as we're seeing through this crisis, if we don't construct the kind of care infrastructure that we need in this country, it is going to force more and more working people to both drop out of the labor force or stay in the labor force, but have to piecemeal work in order to manage the care needs that they have. So I think there's a whole, not only paid leave, but a whole broader set of care policies that I think are in motion right now, and there's opportunities around. I want to name health and safety as another one. Like, really seriously, the way in which people are struggling and dying right now because of the pandemic creates a huge opportunity for us to talk about how we truly value life at work. And I think we know that health and safety, OSHA standards are frankly outdated in terms of being able to really speak to the kind of crisis that we see happening right now, let alone having an administration that's not enforcing any of those standards, and actually having a Congress that wants to give corporate immunity around health and safety standards. So this is another issue, policy lever, that I think is ripe if we as a labor movement could embrace it the right way right now and talk about it from a values framework of people should not be dying, and really push forward like a really updated set of health and policy, health and safety policies now. I'm getting tired. And then, you know, certainly the ongoing opportunities. There's, you know, I took part in work that was happening. So actually all three of us did at some point around some of the reimagining of labor law. And not that I think that changing labor law in itself is enough, but I do think there were some interesting policy levers that came up around corporate, you know, governance questions, the ability for us to think about the pathways to different bargaining mechanisms that actually have life in the policy arena that is worth really exploring and thinking about. And I know Joe and Stephen have been thinking about those too, but there's very specific worker power policies that are at play right now, whether it's wage boards, or if you look at domestic workers, another population of workers that everyone thought could not be organized. And now, you know, in Seattle, in Philadelphia, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights includes standards boards where workers are at the table with the state and with the industry setting standards, and really beginning to build their power and agency. And so I think there's a lot of policy handles like that that are in motion right now. Stop there.
I would just add to that this question that you just raised, Sarita, about the importance of health and safety right now. We're seeing unfolding day by day in recent days a massive national fight about the reopening of schools. And it seems like right there we can have an important fight about how decisions ought to be made about that. And teacher unions have been a source in recent years of great creativity around trying to expand bargaining and thinking about big questions. As Stephen pointed out earlier, the Chicago teachers raising housing as a major issue in their last strike. And I know that some of our teacher allies are thinking about this question of workers needing to have a voice in the decisions being made about the reopening of school systems. And our friends in Los Angeles at United Teachers of LA are organizing a day of action for August 3rd to highlight some of these issues. And I think, Stephen, you know more about that. Maybe you want to add about that, or just in general around this question.
Well, I think, I mean, what's really fascinating is it's not just UTLA. A bunch of the teacher unions around the country have come up with a set of demands that have everything from opening conditions to open schools, but also anti-eviction, about police out of schools. There's a whole long list. So I think there's a moment where almost everything bad that's happening, maybe this is a way to think about this, is everything bad they're doing to us creates an enormous opportunity to flip it's on its head. When they want to open schools and the governor of St. Louis says, well, sure, kids will get COVID, but that doesn't really matter because they'll get better, as if they're all living in orphanages or something. They may be living in orphanages if we follow that. So I think, there's that all the policy ideas that we've had, and we don't have time to go through them all, there's hundreds, are more ripe now because things are worse. But I think one very concrete thing that we really need to be focused on, if we're ever going to tax the rich, this is the moment. This number that I think that the super rich have increased their wealth $550 billion since the pandemic started. This is what's insane, is that they're getting richer. And I think that opens the door for us to say, let's raise taxes on the rich. And if we raise taxes on the rich, that means all sorts of things that were unaffordable, like sick days, all of a sudden become affordable.
That's
so
right.
I think that we really need, like, my sort of urgent call to myself when I look in the mirror every morning, whatever, is if we don't seize this time, we blew 2008. We should be really clear. During the last recession, most of the labor movement sort of said, let's hang on and hope we get back to normal. And if we blow this moment, we are going to be so weakened. People are more ripe, the system's more broken. And so I actually think, I don't really like the word plausible, because if it's plausible, it's probably not big enough. Because we've been trained, we have a version of the Stockholm syndrome. We've been trained that there's not much possible. So I was trained in bargaining early on. Well, don't ask for too much because it's easy to get out on strike. It's harder to get back in. Every bone in our body has been trained not to have audacious, grand demands. And this is the moment for that. It's not the moment for plausible. It's the moment for what's possible if we really imagine the world we want to create and live in, which I think has something to do with the name of the book. We own the future.
Can I just add one piece? I think another ripe opportunity is the amazing conversations that are happening now around divest, invest. And the investment in communities is a huge opening around the kinds of policy ideas we're talking about and the kind of bargaining for the common good demands we're talking about. So that's something for us just to be conscious of and to jump on. Like, we should be shaping what investing in our communities really means and looks like and results in, that allows and creates more pathways to power for working people.
It's a beautiful way to end. Yes, we do own the future. I just want to thank everyone who was involved in bringing this event together, our panelists, Stephen Lerner, Joseph McCartin, and Sarita Gupta. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our audience and the folks who asked the great questions. You'll be receiving follow-up emails about upcoming events. And thanks to everyone who we can't see or who you can't see, who's been working behind the scenes. Thank you to Michael Bennett from the DSA Fund, Sunshine from the Democratic Socialists of America, Flynn Murray from Dissent, and Lawrence also of the Democratic Socialists of America.
And thank you to you, Bianca, for your amazing moderation. Thank you.
I wanted to say that first, Sarita. You have a wonderful style, Bianca. No, really, seriously, it's been much more fun than a lot of these where somebody, it's like a drone is asking you questions. It's been
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. We got to keep the energy up. We have a world to win. And I also, I would be remiss if I miss Emily Janakaram from New Press. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. So the book We Own the Future can be found again online, and you get 25%. I keep looking for the book, sorry. You get 25% if you order it today. It lays out several possible blueprints for a socialist future. So thank you for everyone for helping us to build this future together.